by all the international and foreign affairs ministry sites and resources. Now, Keir Simmons, NBC, over to you.
Thank you very much. Minister, President Putin is described When was the last time you were able to advise him?
Well, first of all, describing what President Putin has been doing and how President Putin has been acting. You prefer to do that basing upon what the Western propaganda have been saying. President Putin over the past weeks had provided detailed comments on our position, that is the position of our leadership, and is presented in full compliance with the constitutional powers of the President of Russia and Security Council of the Russian Federation, Foreign Ministry and other relevant authorities and bodies. This is the work that is carried out on a daily basis, and on a weekly basis we hold meetings of the permanent members of Russia's Security Council. This is what the decision-making mechanism looks like. Thank you. New York is on the line. ABC, just stop, please wait. Please wait. Just ask. У нас два.
Кир, пожалуйста.
Keir, okay, please carry on. Keir.
Thank you. For decades, Russia and America have maintained stability despite fearsome nuclear capability. Can you reassure the world that Russia would not fire a nuclear weapon in anger, would not fire a first strike?
We don't have insane people. We have our military doctrine that describes the parameters and the conditions for applying nuclear weapons. It contains no escalation for de-escalation point. But you know, the talks about the nuclear war are rife now. And please, I would ask you to be attentive and to look at the statements made and the characters that made those statements. First, Mr. Stoltenberg, being erratic and hectic in his propaganda, indulging in propaganda and wishing to have a liking from the most radical Western forces, said that NATO may do whatever it like, even if it decides to place and station nuclear weapons on Eastern European territories. But you know, first of all, NATO may not decide where to place and deploy the nuclear weapons. It's the US that has it, not NATO. But the hint was indicative. Afterwards, Mr. Zelensky started saying and stating that we will abandon and jettison the non-nuclear obligations and status and acquire the nuclear arms. And don't forget what Jean-Yves Le Drian, the French foreign minister, said. You know, the French national symbol is rooster, is the cock, and he said during another round of his interviews with the world, he reminded Mr. Putin that France also possesses the nuclear arms, and afterwards, Madame Truss, the not so long ago appointed foreign secretary, said that she is ready for a conflict between NATO and Russia. And mind your president's statements, Mr. Biden's statements, when responding to a question whether there has been any alternative to the sanctions from hell, so-called, he said that the only alternative is the Third World War, and it only can be a nuclear war. But please mind that it is in the minds of the Western politicians that they keep returning to the nuclear war. It's not in our minds, so we will not allow any provocations to move us out of the equilibrium, shake us out of the equilibrium. But, you know, if a real war is waged or unleashed against us, you know, I think those who have those designs and plans are to think what follows, and I think that there are such plans. And now we're moving to New York. Thank you. ABC, George Stephanopoulos, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister. The world is seeing civilians being killed in Ukraine by Russian bombs. The world is hearing the lies Russia is telling about those attacks. The world is uniting to condemn those attacks and those lies. How can you defend them?
I can see that you have been reading from a paper. You decided to quote the words that you had on paper. I cannot comment conjectures, and there is a great deal of these now. But, you know, if you paid your attention probably to the fact that Europe, mostly, and the United States are trying to close down all the outlets, media outlets and information sources broadcast by Russia and from Russia on how the special military operation progresses and advances, and how the Ukrainian army and the neo-Nazi battalions behave towards the peaceful civilians. They rob and rip off the Donbas settlements. When they fall back, they take vehicles and property from Ukrainian residents living there. They behave like pillagers and marauders. And, you know, there is a lot of information about the future provocations that are brewed in Mariupol and on other territories where the Ukrainians are now trying to use the civilians as a human shield, talk to the Indians, the Arabs and the Africans that are trying to flee Ukraine now. They are not allowed. And yesterday the Indian Prime Minister spoke to the President of Russia, concerned over death of an Indian student in Kharkov. There are no Russian troops in Kharkov now, but we saw the footage like depicting foreigners trying to flee the Ukrainian soil via Russia, and they're not allowed to do so. You know, I don't have enough time now to enumerate all the facts. Please visit our website, the website of our ministry, and you will be able to get a detailed description of what the Kiev neo-Nazi regime is now doing. You like the word killer? You know, real killers are siding with the Kiev regime. We have Beijing Chinese Media Corporation.
Do you believe that President Zelensky, the first Jewish president of Ukraine, whose families were killed in the Holocaust, is a Nazi?
Я думаю, что он манипулируется нацистами.
I think that the Nazis and neo-Nazis manipulate him. Otherwise, it is hard to account for how President Zelensky can preside in a society where neo-Nazism is rife. They make marches and torch processions. And for those torch processions, President Zelensky allocates his personal guards from his company, and they train constantly, studying acts of sabotage and warfare in urban areas. And that is all happening under President Zelensky. And when he keeps saying that his grandfather was at war, look at the laws that President Zelensky, which claims to be a global citizen, well, look at the laws about the indigenous nations and ethnicities of Ukraine, not mentioning the Russian nation. How can not a neo-Nazi president support laws banning the Russian language at school, which is abhorrible, not only in education, but in everyday life? They imposed a prohibition on just asking for drugs and medications in a pharmacy in Russian, and in the Crimea in Russia, they have three official languages: Russian, the Crimean Tatar language, and Ukrainian language. And any national of Russia living in the Crimea has a right to turn to local authorities, to an office, speaking his vernacular language, and they have to respond in that language. I can enumerate facts for quite long. You know those striking images and salient things, and you don't have time to peruse and read the facts and just spend at least half an hour visiting our website, the Foreign Ministry website and the Defense Ministry website. You will not be allowed to raise your voices. I know that. But a French journalist, yesterday actually, President Macron said that accusing Zelensky and Ukraine of the rampant nationalism as allies, well, he responded to him, but his compatriot, a French journalist, responded to him. She visited Donbass and she described the bombings and shellings of schools and the killings of two women that worked in that school, and she put to shame all the Western politicians that turn a deaf ear, a blind eye onto that. She wasn't allowed to put it on the air, but it's available on social media. Please learn more facts. Don't try to pretend that this American action movie is developing according to your plan of absolute good and absolute evil.
The Chinese Media Corporation. So, Mr. Stephanopoulos, could you please give the floor to other journalists? So, could you please respect your colleagues? Thank you. The Chinese Media Corporation, Ms. Li Tuntun, Beijing.
Yes, thank you very much. The questions from the CMG CCTV. Actually, recently, we interviewed some of the former officials of the Europe, and they believe that the NATO had promised not to expand eastward of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they also believe the current sanction against Russia could not solve any problems. But at the moment, we didn't hear any similar remarks from the current officials in Europe and in the United States. So why do you think there are this difference? And we also noticed that the Russian media, including RT and Sputnik News, was blocked in the EU, and fake news and the misinformation all through the social media. So what's your response to this?
Конечно, это уже общеизвестный факт, и это...
Well, it's a well-known fact. We cannot hide it, and this is actually what you have started with. I mean, the assurances given to the Soviet authorities and then to Russian authorities that NATO would not expand eastward, that no part of NATO's military infrastructure would be closer to the Russian borders. And then you have seen what happened next. There were 5 waves of NATO's expansion, and each time the rhetoric of NATO and the plans and the drills have become more purposeful. They targeted Russia, and we have tried to draw the attention to that, but actually we unfortunately did not find the necessary response from the West. NATO doesn't want to alleviate our concerns. It is not for nothing that I have cited the Istanbul Treaty and the Astana Agreement and the assurances given in 2002, when everyone said that no one would ensure the security of one state at the expense of the security of other states, and that no organization in the OSCE had a right to dominate in this very space. And this is what NATO members do not want to fulfill. You have answered a very good question. Why do they need to stick to this very position? I have no other explanation than an obstinate, stubborn desire to retain the dominance in any sphere and to show to everyone that it is NATO that is dictating the rules in Europe. And by the way, Mr. Stoltenberg has stated that NATO is responsible for global security, and the fact that NATO is a defensive alliance is just the empty talk. If NATO was a defensive alliance, it should defend itself, should have defended itself, but no one made an offensive. Well, you remember the Berlin Wall, it actually collapsed, so there should be some way to defend itself without the Berlin Wall. And this line of defense is drawn every time, and now it's close to the Russian borders. We explained it on numerous occasions, and Mr. Putin, in his public statements and in his lengthy talks with the Western leaders, explained it in detail and at length, very clearly and unambiguously. And when the West is talking to us in a bilateral format, it seems that the West understands what we mean. But when the Western countries come together, it seems that something happens. It seems that the United States is giving rules, is giving orders, and it's deplorable. We are open for a conversation, and this conversation will start anyway. But what NATO tried to do with Ukraine, well, everyone knows how the coup d'etat happened, and that was the coup d'etat who had not been provoked by anything, because it happened a day after an agreement between the president and the opposition about early elections was signed, and the opposition would win the elections. And the president asked why you needed that coup d'etat. The agreement would be complied with. And Crimea could have still been Ukrainian if not for the coup d'etat. But under current circumstances, we cannot put up with this threat, because Ukraine was always being turned into anti-Russia. It would always be seen as a foothold to make Russia collapse. Well, you remember Mr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who claimed that Ukraine is nothing without Russia. It's just some regional country, so to say, and Ukraine should be used to undermine Russian interests, Russian influence, the influence on the Russian culture, including, he said that Ukraine should be used to ensure the collapse of the Orthodox Church. And this is what is being done. Mr. Poroshenko has started this, and Mr. Zelensky has kept this going. So once again, we are showing goodwill, but it is impossible and inadmissible to encroach on our interests, creating threats to Russia. We won't allow that to happen. So we're moving to...
Oh, sorry. It's a very short question. Is that how do you evaluate the current situation after talks with Ukraine, and what are the biggest challenges for the further talks? Thank you.
Ну, я не могу сейчас оценивать ситуацию.
Well, I cannot evaluate the situation. The negotiations hasn't started yet. They are about to begin. I believe that the head of the delegation will make an announcement after the negotiations are over.
France 24,
So Paris here, Frank Perelman, France 24.
Mark Perlman with France 24 here. On the diplomatic stage, Russia is very isolated. There was a vote at the United Nations General Assembly. Only 4 countries voted with Russia against a resolution urging Russia to immediately stop its military operations. NATO is probably as united as it's ever been since the fall of the Soviet Union. So diplomatically, it's a fiasco for Russia, isn't it?
Вы знаете, но это вам судить. Я не могу судить о...
Well, it's for you to judge about that. I cannot say that, but I'm sure that it is a very bad thing that people die. We are not talking about a diplomatic fiasco, about a diplomatic failure. I'm thinking about the diplomatic talents of the West. The conflict claimed thousands of people, actually 14,000 people died over those years, 8 years of the war in Donbass, and not a single mass media outlet from the West thought to go to Donbass and have a look how people lived there, the people who have been claimed terrorists by Ukraine, but they attacked no one, and still Ukraine claimed them to be terrorists, and Western mass media outlets could have looked at how schools and kindergartens are destroyed, residential areas are shelled, terrorist attacks are committed. So if you choose to believe that if the West says so, it is indeed so, and if the fact that the Western media and politicians kept silence for 8 years, trying to jeopardize the Minsk agreements when the Ukrainian regime did not honor its obligations under the Minsk agreements. So all those 8 years of silence, if you believe that this is a diplomatic triumph, well, you have a right to think so. You represent the free media. But if you believe that Russia has decided to protect, to uphold its own interests, and NATO is as united as ever, as you said, well, NATO actually has trying to find a sense to exist, raison d'être, and there was Afghanistan, that NATO had left, and there was no excuse to get together and control all the alliances. What Mr. Macron is saying about the strategic independence, the United States has shown what this independence means. This is the triumph of the United States, and this is not for me to say who will suffer from the diplomatic fiasco in this case. And as for the arithmetic that you've mentioned, we know very well the methods used by the Western colleagues to achieve these results. This is an outright blackmail, twisting of the arms. The West tells all other countries to vote as we say, to vote, reminding who has assets in the West, whose children study in the West. I know it very well since friends of mine tell me that they are under this pressure, and they say they cannot vote otherwise because it is actually it is what the well-being of my family depends on. This is the methods that the West has used, but truth will prevail. And once again, I would like to remind you to head over to the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which shows the facts, what the Ukrainian militants did in Donbass, what atrocities it has committed. We do not feel isolated diplomatically, you mean? You see, thank you very much.
Mr. Lavrov, as a second question, is the plan to bring back Viktor Yanukovych in power in Kiev? Is this the end game for Russia?
Ну, вы опять вот задаете вопрос, который показывает, что вы совершенно вот пришли на интервью, даже не почитали то, что говорил президент Путин, да и я говорил неоднократно.
Well, actually,
the
question of the future of Ukraine and the question of who will lead Ukraine is something that the Ukrainian people should decide. And I'm talking about different nationalities and ethnicities of Ukraine.
Newman.
Thank you, Katie Newman, United Kingdom.
Lavrov, I wanted to ask you about Polina Zapadinskaya. She was in her final year of primary school. She was shot dead by the Russians as she was in her family car in Kyiv on Saturday. Mr. Lavrov, I know you have a daughter yourself. I want you to look me in the eye and just tell me, how do you sleep at night knowing that Russian bombs and bullets are killing children?
I cannot say anything to add up on what I have already said. Any human life is precious. All hostilities, unfortunately, result in casualties among servicemen and civilians. Our troops that participate in the special operation have a strict order to use high-precision weapons to render inoperable the military infrastructure, facilities, and in the dorms of the Ukrainian soldiers. They are no target to strikes. I can only render condolences to all those who lost.
High precision is used, but hundreds of civilians have reportedly already died. This is now being investigated by the International Criminal Court. I wonder if you personally are preparing your defense in a war crimes tribunal.
Я понимаю ваше желание такие вот острые вопросы задавать.
I know your desire to ask those tricky and sharp questions, and you will incite your audience. I know that this is your job. It's not about mass media, but rather about being a tool of hammering it into people's mind, the exact things that the Western leaders need. Once again, I reiterate, I don't justify any action that leads to the losses in civilians, but the collateral damage, coinage was not invented by us, but by our Western colleagues during their reckless undertakings in Iraq and other countries before that, in Latin America, in Libya. Have you ever tried applying this emotional zeal, same degree of emotional zeal, when hundreds of thousands of civilians lost their lives in Iraq or Libya or Syria? I can see that you're asking rhetoric questions.
You started this war. Polina's blood is on your hands, isn't it, Mr. Lavrov?
Я не стал бы.
You know, I wouldn't play these games. You are now speaking as a talk show host. If you want to know my position, I have made it clear in every detail, inter alia, with respect to the humanitarian aspects of the operation. But, you know, I know that you will provide the coverage that you need, but just probably any correspondent has a conscience. Even if he or she is taking an order from someone, just recall how you behaved for 7 to 8 years when thousands of boys and girls and old people were killed in Donbass by the Ukrainian regime. Please visit our website. I really wouldn't like to take your time to indulge in many hours of enlisting the details. And if you are preoccupied by the humanitarian after effects of the hostilities, please study these pages that we have on the websites. Thank you. We'll move to the next journalist. Associated Press, United States. Harriet Morris, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Lavrov. Russia has officially lost 500 soldiers in just 1 week of fighting, and other estimates are much, much higher. At this rate, we're looking at one of the most costly campaigns in recent Russian history, far deadlier than Afghanistan and Chechnya, for example. The official message was that Russians would be welcomed with open arms and that the Ukrainian army would lay down its weapons. What has gone wrong?
Ну, вы знаете, это опять...
You know, this is your opinionated view, your subjective view. There are losses, as always happens during such operations. Well, speaking about that, it is not as planned. I'm not sure. I doubt that, what plans we had, that they were sensitive, they were secret, and they underlie what our group of troops has been doing to take the orders by the president of Russia. But this cannot be unhinged from all what happened before, all those 30 years of developments between Russia and the West, and the relations between the West and the rest of the world, and what the United States did. And Putin said that the threat is now on our border, at our border. It has arrived there, and we had data, and we have data that the Pentagon is preoccupied about the chemical and biological installations in Ukraine, because Pentagon built 2 biological war labs, and they have been developing pathogens there in Kiev and in Odessa, and now they are concerned that they may lose control over these labs. And you know what it may be like in future, and the Americans decline flatly and resolutely to start a inspection mechanism as part of the Convention for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and they build new chemical and biological facilities all across Russian borders. And, many other developments happened. The CIA has been on the ground in droves, and they have been training the Ukrainian army not to wage a war with Poland, apparently. And when developments in Iraq happened, when the United States claimed it was a threat to the U.S. national security, did anyone ask back then why the United States decided to bring a territory 10,000 kilometers away from the American coasts to order? Because the U.S. is a great power, but when Russia says that there is a threat to us, they start telling us that there is not a threat at all. But, we will decide what is needed to provide for our security. When it's just close and next to our borders, we will not go 10,000 kilometers away to assert our rules and orders. It is, a forced decision, because we were not taken into account, and they lied to us starting from 1990 or 1991. So at a certain point, I think we will have to come to terms. But, that is to be done basing on the universal comprehensive rules of not strengthening one's security at the expense of others and not aspiring to dominate. It must be equitable and equal partnership, and our Western colleagues are not ready for that, and they are now pretending to be the absolute good with their gross violation of all possible diplomatic means, compelling small and mid-sized countries to act as they are ordered. That happened before in the global history on many occasions. So I would not to forestall assessments. And there is an operation with the clear-cut goals of demilitarizing Ukraine and heading off and precluding deploying any arms that would be a threat to Russia, and denazifying Ukraine, because no one cancelled the verdicts of the Nuremberg trial, and definitely providing guarantees for Ukraine without their adhesion to NATO and accession to NATO. And the president has said that we're ready to talk about the guarantees of Ukraine, Europe, and the rest of the world, and the Russian Federation definitely. We're now heading to Paris once again. TF1, Darius Rojben.
Okay. Can I have my second question? Just to follow on from what you just said there about the Russian demands. You said yesterday that Russia isn't looking for Ukrainian capitulation. Are you now prepared to deal with Ukrainian President Zelensky? And what exactly does he need to agree to stop the fighting? Are you looking to take control of the whole of Ukraine before talks make any kind of progress? And does that mean the full destruction of the Ukrainian army?
Нет, это совсем не означает.
No, that does not mean what you have emotionally been saying now. You know, I try to explain things, and the questions I receive are as if no one listens. You know, we are ready for talks. And when President Zelensky asked for talks, President Putin immediately agreed and sent a delegation. Then Zelensky changed his mind. Probably the Americans told him not to be in a hurry. Afterwards, they said, "Okay, we would come," but later they postponed by one day, and our team waited them there, and the talks took place. And our negotiations position is known to the Ukrainian colleagues, and they promised to come up with their position for this round of talks. We are ready to negotiate, but we will continue the operation because we cannot allow to see that the military infrastructure in Ukraine that is a threat to Russia is untouched, and the demilitarization will be finalized and concluded. Even if we strike the peace accord, it is to have this point anyway. We're heading to Paris. Darius Rosban, TF1.
Yes. Monsieur le Ministre, merci. Emmanuel Macron and Vladimir Putin are frequently in touch. Do you think President Macron and France have a special role to play for a diplomatic solution?
Ну, вы знаете, президент Макрон и Франция...
You know, President Macron and France have had a long track record of negotiating and brokering. We can recall the presidency of Mr. Sarkozy when he tried to settle things and sort out things that started with the criminal order by President Saakashvili to start that operation. And we know that the Normandy Formant was also established with the participation and brokerage of France. Those accords were a very meaningful step for those efforts, but it ended up in nothing. And after it was approved by the UN Security Council, neither France nor Germany did anything to compel Ukraine to honor those agreements. On the contrary, they started saying that it's not the Ukraine but the Russian Federation that is to comply with those agreements, and that there should not be any direct dialogue between Kiev on the one side and Donetsk and Luhansk on the other, because it is all pretenses, and the Russian Federation is to blame. We tried to bring our French and German partners to reason, showing them the texts of the Minsk set of measures and the UN Security Council resolutions saying that all the key issues must be coordinated with Donetsk and Luhansk, but it was of no avail. And I mentioned already the fact that President Macron has been coming up with initiatives, and we talked with the French side, and not long ago he paid a visit, and they talked over the phone with President Putin. And currently, if I'm not mistaken, there is another phone conversation ongoing between them. We would definitely be happy if in this case, this time, France helps reach proper accords that would rely on the OSCE-backed principles and be in conformity with international relations by and large. But when President Macron has stated today, and I have quoted that, saying that the statements about the rampant neo-Nazism in Ukraine is a lies, you know, that is so bizarre. Unless we see how similar things that are happening in Ukraine now towards Jews and Russians, how aggressive the statements that are made in the torture processions and many just physical crimes in Donbass, Centralia. And when the German Chancellor Scholz, who is France's partner for the ex-now Normandy format, said it was ridiculous to say that there are signs of genocide in Ukraine, from the mouth of a German top representative. That is a deplorable thing to hear if our German colleagues don't recognize these manifestations. And not long ago, Chancellor Scholz said that the situation in Europe is very grave, and we haven't seen that for 75 years. Now, just recall the bombings of Yugoslavia. It is in oblivion. It is forgotten by the German colleagues. No matter where we head with our discussion, we see the double standard and this absolute good that our American colleagues champion for, with your help, means that you are allowed to do anything. You may pronounce verdicts when you believe it is appropriate, and you may silence and hush down things that you dislike because the West and the United States are involved. Definitely there is solidarity between you, but this is definitely a blow to the international affairs. It is kind of dictatorship. This is what you are trying to assert on us. No democracy, no equality, no brotherhood.
But once again, the efforts of mediation is something that we welcome, and President Putin explained on numerous occasions to him what the solutions of the current problem can look like, and if President Macron can convince President Zelensky so that he wouldn't go from NATO to the EU, and then...
Please.
Yes, please.
The European Union gives weapons to Ukraine. Do you consider it's an act of war? And do you think there is a risk of slipping into a nuclear war?
Well, I have already said a few words about the nuclear war, and it is not Russia that begins such talks. And Mr. Ledrian reminded Mr. Putin that France does have nuclear weapons, and Mr. Stoltenberg said about that, and he said that NATO would bring nuclear weapons closer to Russia, and Ms. Truss said that Britain was ready to wage war with Russia. You are trying to use these talks to accuse us once again, but the topic of the Third World War or nuclear war is not floated by Russia. It is used to put pressure on the public in the West to keep the Russophobic sentiments alive. And you go as far as a Russian is abroad is under aggression. Students are expelled. Athletes cannot take part in contests. I have understood what it is. It is unfair competition, so that it would be easier for you to perform in culture, in sports, and in other spheres. It is an unscrupulous action. It is not good, and I hope that you